I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
Oh, we're back, and it is can we call it a doozy today?
It's a doozy. We have got a true classic. One of the great, I think maybe the greatest.
Bad poem ever written.
Maybe I was going to say greatest works of Chinese literature. Yeah, we're getting into Mystery Science Theater 3000 territory. Where
oh, man.
It's so bad that it's fascinating. It really is. We're going to be talking about one specific poem.
So we've talked about poets, Tang Dynasty poets, Li Shangyin, Du Fu, Li Bai. What poem are we looking at? What amazing work of art are we looking at?
Today we are looking at, from the Diary of Lei Feng, the poem Ode to a Dump Truck.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Is that Ode to a Dump Truck?
Ode to a Dump Truck.
Oh, yes. My goodness.
Context. If you have been in China before, you know who Lei Feng is.
You know who Lei Feng is because you see his face everywhere. Even today, I mean, I was in Gansu in 2014. I saw propaganda poster for making a green Lei Feng, and it had the traditional Lei Feng image made up of green leaves.
And the first time I went to teach in China full-time was in Shandong province in Tai'an.
Yeah.
Got out of the train station at Tai'an. The first thing I saw was a huge bust of Lei Feng.
Wow.
In the square outside the station. I mean, like 15, 20 feet high.
When I ask Chinese people, how do you translate the word volunteer into Chinese, they just say to do Lei Feng.
So, we keep giving you these descriptions, but who was Lei Feng? So,
did Lei Feng actually exist?
We've got pictures of a guy who calls himself Lei Feng. We're sounding kind of cagey and conspiratorial here, but the reason we say it this way is because any story, any presentation of an ideal always tends to cast doubt on the veracity of the document. So Lei Feng was born when? The 40s?
He was born in 1940. He died in 1962. In that time, he was supposed to be your average nobody, model worker, serving communism.
Helping old ladies cross the street, putting their jackets down on puddles.
Yeah.
Their entries in the diary of him, standing out in the rain to help people fix trucks and things, even though all of his comrades are inside the tent. He's outside serving the people. So like any document of this kind, A, you read it and you think, I have a hard time believing anyone actually lived this way. B, and more importantly, there's lots of photographs of somebody who purports to be Lei Feng.
But he died in 1962 as a nobody.
As a nobody. Because that's part of the story. Because if he was a big, famous writer and a communist, it just wouldn't be as good. But if the diary is by just somebody not motivated by money or fame, just out there serving Mao and the people, then it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
Except I don't know many people who actually buy it in China.
You don't think a lot of people still buy it?
I don't think so.
Because, I mean, the communists still use it so much. You would think that it has to have some purchase power.
I just wonder, because there's so much stuff that's done in the name of sort of furthering the communist ideal in China that I wonder how many people actually believe, even in the party, or that's just what they've always done, so why not? Because if you stop, don't you have to say sort of implicitly, all right, we know this is pretty much not true. But so like when I was teaching there for a while, I taught a high school class for a couple of months. It was an SAT prep course, actually, after school. Anyway, and it was Lei Feng Day, and I asked the students, what do you all think of Lei Feng? And they all started to laugh. And one of the students was he just basically said, right, like we're supposed to believe this bumpkin from the middle of nowhere with no fame whatsoever has a camera crew following him. Why? Or that every night after working, 15 hours a day, fixing trucks and working in a coal mine, he sits up late at night and writes in a diary every single day.
I guess so. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Lei Feng, the guy who served the Communist Party, wasn't the same guy who was kind of filmed. But I think the other question that people oftentimes have is the diary even real?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we think that the dude actually probably did exist.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't invented entirely by the Communist Party.
No.
And maybe he was like this idealistic servant of Mao and the Communist Party. But his diary was used thoroughly by the propaganda apparatus.
And pretty soon after his reputed death. It wasn't like 30 years went by and then someone discovered. We're not talking about the Diary of Anne Frank here. This is meant to be something that's spontaneous, and yet within a couple of years of his death, it's already being touted as this great monument to communism.
And it becomes a huge ideological instrument in the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah. And one of the things that a lot of people resent in China, and I've heard this said from cab drivers, students, kind of all over the spectrum, is, okay, so the common people, we're all supposed to be like Lei Feng. But all the party members and people in government get to be like, Bill Gates. They get to actually make the money. We have to sacrifice ourselves for the party. So the story's kind of worn thin.
Yeah.
But the reason we talk about it is because it's such a remarkable and remarkably weird document.
It's incredibly weird. I mean, to touch on something, we've been talking about, like, whether or not it's true. Like, there are multiple versions of this, and it's constantly being revised during these different kind of political periods to suit the political needs, and that leaves this kind of weird shape. And
of course, to play devil's advocate, the same thing is true of the Diary of Anne Frank. The original version, as it was collected by her father, is not the one we have. It's been heavily edited.
By her father, right?
By her father and by the several publishing companies, depending on the audience that was going to read it. She had some ferociously anti-German screeds in there. They edited out to make her seem like a more balanced, kind girl. All that to say that if you're going to be publishing
I always knew Anne Frank was just
suspect,
a horrible person.
I didn't say that, Lee. Let's be careful. We're going to have to put a retraction somewhere on our page. But it is true that when you have a mass release of what is supposed to be a diary and therefore very personal, you run the risk, if Lei Feng is supposed to be the model communist, of having some things in there that model communists aren't supposed to say. Like, what if he one day was really, really tired and wrote something like, you know what, I'm tired of this. I'm going to put my red book in a hole for a while and I'm just going to do something else. Well, obviously you can't leave that in there because there's a reason to publish this.
I think we've talked enough about the book. Tell me about this poem.
I can do better than tell you about the poem, Lee.
Hang on. Are we going to get to read the poem?
We're going to read it. There are 3 stanzas.
Okay.
And we'll each take turns.
Okay.
Like big boys.
Can I please start?
You can start.
Oh, thank you so much, sir.
Ode to a Dump Truck by Lei
Truck.
Feng. Please.
As translated by Robin Lee. The first time I approached the body of the dump truck was like the sound of thunder in the sky. Frightened, I left back 2 paces. In fact, it was returning from work with a bed full of coal. I heard the schwa-schwa sound fill half the sky, and the whole truck was full. Its cargo, it turned out, clattered and gleamed.
The motor roaring, the dump truck is like a great dragon mosquito. Up and down it is surging and mixing without cease. Your power is limitless. Your tasks are weighty and glorious. You sometimes are a little ill, and in our workers' hearts, it is even more painful than losing our hands and our eyes.
Dump truck, oh dump truck, I working beside you am so proud. By your side, I am willing to serve loyally to the end. Stretch out your friendly hand, dump truck. You and I together walk towards communism.
An extremely emotional poem.
That was some nice declaiming.
That was very, and you have to declaim on a line like dump truck.
Oh
dump truck. How do you not declaim on that? Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So, a few things. Why a poem? The whole pretense of this journal is that it's this spontaneous record of someone serving the party and the people. But this is a poem. Poems are not very accessible, and this is particularly a poem written in a very modern style. Most people, even ordinary, not particularly poetry fan readers, would be familiar with classical diction, Tong poetry. This is not
Tong poetry.
This almost borders on the experimental, so why a poem in a propaganda document?
I mean, there's no rhyme. Literally, there's no rhyme to this poem. There's no there's no rhythm. Mm-mm. There's nothing really that makes it a poem other than the fact that there are stanzas.
Yeah.
And lines.
And possibly the tone of the language itself.
But you can Yeah, I'm just not buying. Is it a poem even?
That's a question I can't answer. Maybe someone edited it into a poem, and in fact, it wasn't written. Maybe it was written in prose. Who knows? One of the things that strikes me about this is this not an isolated incident.
No, he's writing poetry all throughout this diary.
And all through the era, there is poetry of this style. So there's an entire collection, for example, by a poet named Li Ji called Petroleum Poems. And it's really just poetry, some of them very interesting, about just life in the petroleum fields in northeastern China. That's the whole thing. And there's a similar tone. There's this peculiar identification with the machines.
Can I ask you first, do you actually think this kind of poetry moved people when they were reading it at the time? Let's say during the 60s or during the Cultural Revolution?
I honestly have no idea. I've always wondered that because it's not like there was an abundance of poetry to read. It's not like every bookstore was stocked with volumes and volumes of every poetry you'd want to read. This is Maoist China. Things are being weeded out and edited out.
The only thing you can read as poetry is this kind of
stuff. And stuff like this, yeah. So it is in fact possible that there was some enjoyment involved in this. But there's also something involved, even regardless of which culture you go to, in writing poetry for the sake of sort of cultural street cred. Like, Lei Feng wasn't just a guy working in a dump truck, on a dump truck, whatever. He also wrote poetry. So just because he was one of the people doesn't mean he couldn't write. And then, of course, conceivably, the conceit here is if he's that young when he starts, he's probably not, he never went to college, he may not have even finished high school, but yet looking to write poetry. So the suggestion is
that the proletariat can write poetry.
They can just spontaneously erupt into high culture.
I mean, that's a very romantic idea, right? Like in English Romanticism, I know there was this obsession for a while with John Clare. He's, this poet who was, not uneducated, and he decided to write poetry. It's quite bad, I think. But he was embraced by these other romantic poets who thought poetry just sprung out of your breast, like something from the gods, the kind of sublime.
But this is reflective of what the Communist Party wanted to get out there, that it was not that just siding with the people, the lowest classes, the worker, peasant, soldier classes that Mao called them, did not mean an elimination of quote-unquote high culture. And in fact, in his famous speech at the Yan'an Conference,
1942,
one of the things he says is dedicating art and literature to these classes not only will involve more people, but it will also heighten the quality of the art we're producing. So he's making two claims. One, we're going to be relating to people better. And two, the art itself is actually going to get better.
But to take this back to the poem, he was wrong in that art did not get better. It actually got much, much worse. The whole point about the dump truck poem that we're trying to make is that this is really crap poetry. It's hilarious, but it's not something you'd ever want to read like you read, Wordsworth.
Right.
This is bad poetry.
And what's interesting about this is that the communist elite who are helping to craft this stuff are not unaware of good poetry. Mao wrote poetry. There's some disagreement about whether he was a good or a bad poet.
But he was certainly well-read.
He was well-read and knew his classics. Yeah. He trained in the beginning of the 20th century before this stuff was verboten. So he knows poetry. And this is still being put forward. Now, one of the ideas, of course, is that because it's in a journal, it shouldn't sound like an edited poem. It should sound like someone just threw it together after working on a dump truck for a while.
Sure does.
It sure does.
It almost sounds like something that may have fallen off of a dump truck, if I could say.
Right. But, it's funny because why is this even here? I can't answer this question, I suppose, but I can think of interesting reasons for it. Let's make him sound more cultured. But ultimately, it's propaganda. So why do you need a poem?
Yeah.
Especially a bad poem.
I kind of wonder, do you think it was to try and market Lei Feng as this intellectual guy? Or do you think it was to try and entertain the masses who were reading this, and this, they thought, would be considered good poetry?
Well, one of the ideas, and it's, I think, at least a fairly new idea, is that the Communist Party in the Maoist era did have an interest in quote-unquote culturing the people. The idea was not to literally wipe out all written culture and just everyone read journals and newspapers and things. There was a desire for them to know what poetry was, to know what painting and music and all these things were. Just a certain kind. So
that, again, goes back to the Yan'an 1942 conference. But that certain kind, like when you limit so much what you can read, it necessarily, I think, becomes crap. And this is one of the problems with communism and authoritarianism in general, as far as an artist would be concerned, is that you necessarily, like, if you only read acceptable things, the things that you can write and the things that you can produce, the things you can paint get smaller and smaller, not only because the state is more and more concerned about, like, you getting things right, which is their definition of right, like you getting things ideologically correct as far as they're concerned, but also, like, you just get dumber and dumber. Like, reading this kind of poetry makes you dumber. I don't think we are really all that much worse off, and frankly, listener, I would encourage you to read the translation that we're going to provide you on the podcast, because it's not going to make you that much dumber. But if this is all you have as far as poetry, you actually get worse. You go back. You devolve.
Yes and no. And we don't want to go too far down this rabbit trail, so I'll keep this short. But one of the things that enabled the explosion of new poetry and art in the late 70s, early 80s, after Mao died, was in fact this crap poetry. Because what happens is that poets are only given a certain number of subjects, and they're expected to sort of make them sound wonderful for a communist audience. Well, you can't do that with the poetic craft you have, so you have to develop new techniques and approaches to make the old recycled crap actually look good. And so a lot of the changed line lengths, a lot of the really peculiar imagery, and it does get very peculiar by the end of the 60s, actually leads to...
peculiar?
Yeah, but that's why it's probably a good example. The way he's talking about a dump truck. No one wrote poetry about dump trucks, even in the May 4th movement. So bringing in this extremely vernacular and peculiar imagery, once you get into the late 70s and you start reading the quote-unquote Misty School, Bei Dao and Duo Duo and some of the truly great modern Chinese poets, you can't read this direct influence in there, but they're commenting on things in such a way that is fairly experimental, and it traces its lineage to this, you're a good poet, but you're working with crap material. What do you do?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that they may be writing against the restraints of the Cultural Revolution, the Misty poets that you mentioned, and to a certain degree Haizi, but they were never, I mean, they kind of like grew up in that, but the whole thing that makes them much better is that they got the chance to get out of that. And like getting out of, I mean, like maybe that can be a sufficient kind of topsoil, but you really need that kind of deep cultural root to bloom.
And I'm not saying that they went out and read Lei Feng and then started writing poetry. But to say that, like a lot of people do, you have Maoist poetry, and then there's a gap, and then real poetry starts, is frankly silly. Because that assumes that none of these poets, none of these writers ever had any contact with this material. And yet for quite a few of them, you couldn't just walk into a store and pick up Keats or T.S. Eliot. That was very hard to find. This was your poetry.
That was hard to find before 1976. After 1976, It became quite easy.
Right, but when you look back at the poetry written by these guys, a lot of it starts in the mid-60s, and it's already experimental.
But it's bad.
Not all of it.
Really?
When I say they, I mean guys like Duo Duo. Gu Cheng has poems dating, I think, back to the early 60s. And it's definitely different from Lei Feng. I'm not making the argument Lei Feng's poetry is actually really good. What I'm saying is, from a historical perspective, to simply say, it's crap, let's have done with it, ignores some interesting connections that, frankly, make it worth studying, worth thinking about anyway.
I'm skeptical, but
That's because you're a Philistine.
I am willing to be convinced by someone who's much more of an expert on contemporary Chinese poetry than I am. which is you.
Let's look though at a couple of specific things in here.
Yeah.
There's a tendency in this era to sort of identify with machines. And in this poem, for example, this is maybe my favorite line. I don't know. He says, "You sometimes are a little ill, and in our workers' hearts it is even more painful than losing our hands and our eyes." Good grief.
That's really painful.
That's very painful.
I haven't lost my hands or my eyes yet, but it seems kind of tough.
It was a pretty rough way to go.
Do you think that's hyperbole? Do you think we're supposed to actually believe this, or is he being honest?
I mean, how do you know? How do you judge the intent of a writer? But what's interesting, though, is that I would say this is a fairly common technique. I wrote a paper once on film crews in Maoist China. The ones that went out way into the countryside with their equipment to show all the propaganda films. And there are stories praising these guys who protect their equipment with their own body heat at night. Guys who are literally sleeping with their cameras, protecting them as though they were extensions of their own body. Petroleum poems. There's people talking about, the oil pump is an extension of me, etc., etc. It's really weird.
It's weird here, too. I mean, I just don't know what to make of it.
There is the question of efficiency. One of the buzzwords in any Stalinist economy, which Mao was definitely hoping to keep China more or less on a wartime economy footing. The goal is the idea would be to work like a machine. You never get tired. You never get cold or hungry. You're always out there no matter what for the people.
But I guess the thing about that is, I don't actually think this poem was written by Lei Feng. I think it was written somewhere
probably
in Beijing.
It wouldn't surprise me, yeah.
A guy who's, in the propaganda department. So all of this poem, and really the whole diary itself, could be summed up in that line. That you are just an extension of this machine. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to aestheticize kind of you being used by them.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all this is.
In the sort of emotional economy of this era, that was a praiseworthy thing. Why? Because who you are is way less important than who the people are. You by yourself, you're just literally a cog. And if you function like a good cog, then the grand machine that is the people, it works, it moves.
I think Lei Feng, in another part of his diary, actually says, "I am just a cog."
Yeah, you're right, he does. I remember that now. It's an actual line in the poem.
I guess to try and wrap this up, is there any hope for this kind of poem besides being like the butt of a joke?
It's interesting for the development of literature in China. It's interesting historically.
It's interesting for what it says about that period.
Yes, for sure.
As a poem,
I would never read this for fun.
Really?
Oh no. Goodness gracious.
Good. I'm just glad we're on the same page.
Yeah, no. Aesthetically, we're on the same page. If you gave me the choice between Bei Dao or Lei Feng, that's a no-brainer. Right. I find this era fascinating, partly because nobody reads it. If you're going out to choose an era because of how much you love the poetry, this is not where you go, right? But if you're wanting to learn something about the development of modern thought in China, this is a really interesting place to go. By the 80s, very, very few people in China know and enjoy the misty poetry that we talked about. I mean, I ask, a lot of people, we've talked about Haidt, a lot of people know who he is. I mentioned Bei Dao, who's the most famous of the misty poets, and maybe 20% know who he is. The rest are like, I think I may have heard his name somewhere before. Yeah. But nobody's read him. So I guess my final comment would be that there's two ways to look at a poem like this. One is it's aesthetically, frankly, garbage. The other is that there were writers in this era who suddenly had the opportunity to have an audience. If you're a poet, you don't have an audience, right? All of a sudden, you have the opportunity to be read by maybe millions of people. If you write it this way, and it's an intoxicating idea. It's not the only situation. My favorite writer, Czesław Miłosz, who's a Polish poet, had friends after the communist occupation of Poland who did exactly this. And because no one had ever read their stuff, and now all of a sudden they're in all the party circulars and everyone's reading their writing, and they're like, this is amazing. Right? It is interesting to think about what motivated a writer like this.
If he was actually the writer.
Any writer. It doesn't have to be Lei Feng. It could be whoever worked for the party penning it. Okay. And then my final thing is just how fascinating it is that even in an era when, we would consider good writing was not particularly valued, it was still important for people to read poetry. That's interesting, and I'm not sure what to do with it, but it's there.
Okay. I think that's a fascinating point. I just want to end on this.
Yes, please.
Li Bai, Wang Wei, Du Fu, Li Shangyin, Lei Feng? Question mark.
I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.